Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session, Integrating Reflection in Teaching and Learning. I'm Catherine Lithgow, the Senior Educational Developer, Integrative and Experiential Learning with the Center for Teaching Excellence. And with me is Victoria Fapp.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria, and I am the liaison to the Faculty of Arts, as well as the affiliated and federated institutions of Waterloo, also with the Center for Teaching Excellence.
So there has been a lot of interest in incorporating reflection into courses, and since the pandemic, this interest seems to have grown even more. So in response, we're putting together a series of webinars to take a closer look at integrating reflection into teaching and learning. This webinar is the first in the series, and during this webinar, we are going to address questions like, where does reflection fit into your and your students' plans? What should students reflect on? How can you get started designing reflective activities for your course? And what are some of the approaches you might take to assessing reflection? Now, we won't be able to answer all your questions about integrating reflection into teaching and learning today, but we do hope to begin answering some of them, and we hope that you'll join us for subsequent sessions. So to start, let's look at why. So why would we even bother reflecting? So have you ever had this happen? You spend a lot of time creating meaningful activities and experiences for your students, and then at the end, you find out that they seem to have missed the whole point of your experience. So many of you are likely familiar with Kolb's learning cycle. It's a 4-stage cycle that explains how we learn through experience. And what I would like you to note is that first, it is a cycle. It happens on an ongoing basis, and it explicitly references the need for reflection in order to make sense of our experiences and to avoid having our students have the experience but miss that meaning. So why is reflection critical to learning? So on its own, an experience without reflection could just be an experience. And that experience actually might be detrimental to the learning that we would like our students to have or to have gained from that experience. Ash and Clayton talk about without reflection, experience alone might actually cause us to reinforce stereotypes, offer simplistic solutions to complex problems, and generalize inaccurately based on limited data. They actually go on to say that by engaging in critical reflection, it helps us articulate questions, confront biases, examine causality, contrast theory with practice, and identify systemic issues, all of which will help foster this critical reflection and knowledge transfer. And that's why reflection is such a critical part of learning. Reflection helps us make meaning of our experiences, and more important, it informs the actions that we might take in the future. So I'm going to pass it over to Victoria to tell us a little bit more about what is reflection.
Thanks, Catherine. All right, so what is reflection? Well, we all probably have an idea of what reflection means to us, but we're going to go back a little bit in time and look at what some of the experts have had to say about reflection and how that informs how we understand reflection today. So one of the main people that we often refer to when thinking about reflection is, of course, John Dewey. So John Dewey said, we don't learn from experience, we learn by reflecting on experience. And according to Dewey, reflection is a lot of things. Firstly, reflection is a learned skill. This means that it has to be practiced and it can be informed and improved upon by receiving feedback. Reflection is also a complex, rigorous, and intellectual exercise at the same time as it being an emotional exercise. So reflection takes into account both this intellectual side and emotional side, and that will be important to our understanding of reflection moving forward. And as we've already heard and will continue to hear throughout this presentation, reflection is a meaning-making process. So it allows us to take a look at something that we've done and discover what does that actually mean for us, so that we can move forward and do things differently or iterate on something that's worked well. Reflection can help us set goals and use what we've learned in the past to inform future action and consider the real life implications of our thinking. So that's important too. Reflection connects to how we live in the world, the real life implications of our actions and what we think of them. In essence, it's the link between thinking and doing. And like any skill, it takes time to do well. It's not something that we do it innately, but to do it in a way that really makes a difference to how we understand something, such as what we're learning in school or how we are living in our life, we have to take time to practice it and do it well. So also, according to Dewey, the process of reflection moves the learner from a disturbing state of perplexity. So we can see our little fox character on the left side is in this state of perplexity, or also what Dewey called disequilibrium. And he's in this space because he is yearning for balance. So he's experienced something that has made him stop and think and begin to ask questions, to inquire about the meaning of that experience and why he feels this sense of perplexity or disequilibrium. And he wants to move toward harmony and equilibrium. And that is done by doing reflection. So again, he's kind of off kilter. He starts to ask questions. And when he starts to ask questions, that starts to move him into this state of reflection, which eventually becomes harmony or equilibrium. So moving away from Dewey, sort of, we come to Rogers, and Rogers was a scholar of Dewey. So she looked at everything Dewey wrote really closely and really summarized Dewey's criteria for reflection as follows. Reflection is a meaning-making process. So that's something that, again, is really fundamental to what reflection is and why we do it. It is systematic, rigorous, and disciplined, and it has roots in scientific inquiry. So it's not fluffy, even though there's emotion involved. It really breaks things down and helps us look at our experiences in like a scientific way. Reflection needs to happen in community, and reflection requires attitudes that value personal and intellectual growth. And we're going to unpack these last two, numbers 3 and 4, a little bit further because they're sort of new to our understanding of reflection so far. So firstly, we're looking at the third criteria. Reflection needs to happen in community. So reflection is a socio-cognitive process. It's thinking that we do, not sometimes with others, but always with the understanding that our actions and our thinking take place in the wider world and have consequences for ourselves and for the world that we live in. And because of that, we must take responsibility for our learning and ask questions like, what are the real life implications of my thinking? So our meaning making doesn't stand in isolation from our view of the world, but grows out of and leads back into it, and possibly demands that our view change radically. It might also mean that the way in which we participate in the world has to change. So This is sort of the lofty goal of reflection, to be able to bring us to the point that our thinking, our inquiring about our actions actually leads to a change in the way we see things and a change in our actions and what they mean in the world. That reflection needs to happen in community also means that reflecting in community, so literally in groups with other people, can be something that starts the feeling of disequilibrium. So hearing about how others act in the world and experience the world can be the thing that makes us begin the process of inquiry that leads to reflection. And the fourth criteria for reflection, according again to Rogers, who looked very closely at Dewey, reflection requires attitudes that value personal and intellectual growth. So curiosity about and enthusiasm for subject matter is essential to good teaching and good learning. This curiosity motivates reflection. Learners need to be curious and enthusiastic about their learning and experience in order to engage in a way that Dewey called with wholeheartedness. So these attitudes of personal growth and intellectual growth and valuing them and curiosity, these attitudes are what we need to engender in ourselves, our students, in order for them to reflect with wholeheartedness. And I'm going to pass this back to Catherine, who's going to take everyone through what should students reflect on.
Great, thanks, Victoria. So now we know why reflection is important. It's a meaning-making exercise that ideally is going to inform our future actions, or at least allow us to reimagine our future actions. And we've also discussed what reflection is. So now what I want to do is look a little bit more deeply at what we could actually have our students reflect on. And to do that, what I'd like to do is revisit Kolb's. So one aspect of Kolb's is this concrete experience. And this refers to the area where we involve ourselves fully in an activity and encounter it firsthand. So some of the things that we might do in our courses in our program is offer concrete experiences such as laboratories, observations, simulations, games, might be field work, readings, films, problem sets, examples, have our students read primary texts. The experiences could also include things like co-op work term experiences or work experiences without being a co-op, volunteer experiences, extracurricular or co-curricular or service learning. We actually might even ask, the whole purpose might be to have our students really think about the feelings or the reactions or the transferable skills that are associated with those particular experiences. So when we move to the next aspect of Kolb's learning environment, learning cycle, you know, the observations and reflections, some things we want to keep in mind are, once you've offered a particular kind of experience, when you ask your students to reflect on it, make sure that you explicitly connect it back to the reflective, sort of connect those reflective activities back to your course program learning outcomes, or to specific assignments, or to course concepts, or to experiences. But make sure that you make that explicit connection back to something in the course or the program or the assignment or activity. When we design these reflective activities, try and do it so that it supports integration of learning across courses, or to engage students with bigger questions that are related to community or public issues that matter beyond your classroom. So ideally, reflective activities should ask students to consider, you know, messy and ill-defined problems that don't necessarily have a right answer. And it's these kinds of questions that will help students move towards that higher order thinking or the higher levels of reflection. So some other things that we can ask our students to reflect on besides these concrete experiences is we might want them to look at the process that they have taken while completing the different activities or participating in your different experiences. What we want to do in this particular thing is help the students move beyond the product and actually start thinking about the process that they're going through and making what typically is invisible visible to them. For example, if one of your activity has them undertake or participate in a research project, one of the things you might ask them to do is think about how will you approach, your research topic or assignment. When you're having them complete an assignment and you're introducing it, one of the things you might do is actually have them, think about what do you have to do to complete that assignment. If some of your activities or assignments involve working in groups, you might want them to think about what am I going to do to make this group work well together. After they've studied for an exam and you've returned it, you might actually take them through what we call an exam wrapper, where you ask them to think about how they prepared for the exam, what kind of errors they made on the exam, and what they might do differently next time. If you've got writing and editing exercises, you might want them to think about what are the steps that are actually involved when I'm undertaking the process of writing. And in reading, the kinds of questions you might ask might be as simple as, in this journal article or in any journal article in our discipline, what sections do I have to look at for different pieces of information? So basically what you're trying to do is make the process more explicit to the students. Another way that we might have our students reflect is have them take different perspectives when they're looking at different activities or experiences. So if we have them take a forward-looking reflection, you might have introduced a particular theory and you might ask them to think about how would this particular theory work in a particular context. Or you might ask them to think about how this theory is going to work in a different context. So you're asking them to take a forward-looking approach. You could also have them look backwards. So after they have completed something, you might want to have them reflect on how much did you know about this particular topic before we started, and what was that process that you had to go through in order to produce this final piece. Inward-looking reflections, that asks them to look at maybe processes that they go through or learn more about themselves. So what resources and strategies do they tend to favor, and which ones do they tend to ignore? And finally, we might have them take an outward-looking approach where they're not so much concerned about their own actions, but they're starting to think about how other people are acting or thinking. So you might have them undertake an exercise where they reflect on the ways that their process was similar or different to those of their peers. If they're on a work term, you might ask them to think about how their co-workers have interacted with a supervisor in a way that maybe is different than the approach that they take. You might ask them to look at the way their supervisor communicates information to you and talk about what the benefits or what some of the challenges are and provide examples. So an important piece about reflection, again, as we talk about it, you have to practice it and you have to do it continually. So if you recall Kolb's learning cycle, remember that it is a cycle. It happens over and over again. And recall too that reflection is learned. So again, it's the practice and receiving feedback that helps us improve. So with that in mind, you'll want to make sure that you provide opportunities for reflection, not only in your own course, but throughout the program. So when you're in the course, try and give them opportunities to reflect more than once. In a particular study that we were involved with, we found using the STAR format, which we'll talk about in a minute, it was a particular framework, and we found the students had to participate in those reflective questions at least 3 times before they finally they were finally engaged in the process and recognized what it was they were supposed to be reflecting on. So ideally, it has to happen more than once. And again, it should be integrated and scaffolded, not just in your course, but they should be seeing it in the program as well. There's evidence that says that reflective thinking in higher education tends to be very superficial unless it's approached in a consistent and systematic way. And these deep reflective skills can be taught, but again, they require development and practice over time. So not just in your course, but throughout the program. At the faculty level, even if you don't have formal reflections, embedded in your course assignments, you can still model the reflective behavior. So for example, during class discussions, you might model the reflective process by asking the kinds of questions that members of your discipline typically ask. And as you do that, you would explicitly point out how you're supporting a particular claim with evidence. As you go through the process, explain to them that you are in fact modeling the critical reflection process. At the institution level, we offer a number of experiences to our students. So co-ops, study abroad, co-curricular activities, all of these would benefit from reflection in order to help students make meaning or make sense of that experience. So in essence, what we want to do is to prepare our students to become lifelong learners. We want them to be engaged and responsible members of our discipline and socially responsible members of society. We want to set them up for success after they graduate. And in fact, after graduation, our students are going to be expected to continue learning, and they're going to have to show evidence of how they are developing their skills or their competencies. Think about regulated professions that our students might become involved with. At a minimum, when they apply for different jobs or different experiences, they're going to have to articulate skills to an audience beyond an instructor. And so what we're trying to do is help them be able to do that in a competent manner. Again, when we're implementing or integrating these reflective activities, we have to remember that students have competing priorities. So when students can't see how those experiences or activities that we've provided are relevant to life beyond the classroom, or when they're asked to reflect maybe only once in a course, or they only encounter a reflective exercise a couple of times throughout a program, or when they are asked to reflect, but they're not given any feedback on how to help them reflect critically, they're going to start asking, why am I even engaging in this reflection or this reflective process? And they're not going to invest in that process. What we have to do then is help students answer that question. We have to help them see the value in the reflection, and we have to help them see the impact that reflection can have on their learning and on their lives. And ways that we can do this is to pay attention to some of the aspects of designing our reflective exercises. So a couple of things we want to look at are intentionality. When we design these, we want to do it in a coherent and educationally purposeful manner. We don't want them to be reflecting on things for the sake of reflecting, but rather on something that is meaningful. We also want them to, be transparent. So we want to make the goals and components of our course and the reflections understood by students. And when we do this, this helps motivate our students and helps them begin to see the connections that this exercise has to learning that takes place in other areas of their life. If you think back to Rogers and Dewey talking about reflection taking place in community, remember that the interactions don't have to happen just between you and the student, but you could have them reflect with others, including their peers or even community partners. So you can have meaningful interactions that move the students beyond just talking to you. They're actually including peers or others when they're reflecting. And the reflections should be structured and take place throughout the duration of the learning experience. So you don't want it to happen just at the end or, as sort of the summary of their experience, but you actually want them to think about how they got there And so by having them, providing them with opportunities to reflect throughout that learning experience helps the students see how they are developing those knowledge and skills and understandings. So I'm going to pass it over to Victoria to talk about the different ways that you can get started designing these reflective activities for your course.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so I'm sure at this point in the presentation, as we've taken you through what reflection is and why it's important, and some of the things that you might have students reflect on, you're probably wondering, you know, what's my next step? How can I actually start to realize this process in my course? And one way that you can do that is by using reflective frameworks or models. So there are several models that can get you started. And just to note at the beginning that you'll find commonalities between all of these frameworks. The language differs, but the broad strokes are similar. So the message is really to choose the one that works for you. Some frameworks may be more helpful to you depending on what you want your students to reflect on. But if you're new to incorporating reflections, definitely consider starting with one of these existing frameworks. And then as you get more experience with them, you will be able to tweak them. So let's dive in. So before we look at specific frameworks, one thing that you'll notice that these frameworks do have in common is that they all include questions that your students can ask themselves at different stages of the reflective process. Ideally, the questions are provocative, and for that, we have provided or linked to some question prompts, and all of these resources will also be shared at the end. But there are prompting questions out there, not only in these models you'll see on the next slides, but through other resources. And then provide opportunities for students to make connections to experiences outside the classroom, remembering that reflection happens in community, and what students learn about themselves can have a real impact on themselves and the world. And provide interesting activities, assessments, problems, and tasks that create this sense of equilibrium, or disequilibrium, sorry, and perplexity, as Dewey called it. So all of these ideas, these provocative questions or question prompts, encouraging students to connect beyond the classroom, and interesting activities, these are built into the models that we're going to explore now. And the goal is really, again, that movement from perplexity to harmony. So let's take a look at the first model. The first one is Bain's 5 R's, which is sometimes called the 4 R's. So it's called the 4 R's because it's very common for the reporting and responding stages, the initial stages of reflection, to sort of be collapsed together. It just happens that students tend to write about those two aspects at the same time. So sometimes you'll find this referred to as the 4 R's. So something to note here is that, like everything we'll see going forward, these are stages. And what's important about that is the beginning stages, such as reporting and responding, ideally are done thoroughly and thoughtfully and well in order for the later stages, like relating, reasoning, and reconstructing, to be just as strong. Often, if there isn't a strong foundation, things will start to crumble as they reach to the top. So the important message to take away from this and this model is that you really want to spend time with your students looking at each stage and why each stage is important and why it needs to be done well in and of itself in order to build up to really strong conclusions and action plans at that reconstructing phase. Another model, and one that has been used on Waterloo campus before, is called the STAR model, or sometimes STAR L, or sometimes START. So the L is for learning in this case, but sometimes that last step is called transfer, and that's where you'll see this model referred to as START. This one was developed from a behavioral psychology perspective, and what it really does is it helps students to document evidence of their learning and professional capabilities as evidence that they can draw on for situations like job interviews, enabling them to address specific selection criteria and demonstrate their strength and applicability to the job. So often in job interviews, we are asked things like, tell me about a time when you were involved in, et cetera, et cetera. And STAR gives a way for your response or students' responses to be organized in the most effective way. And then that last column, whether it's learning or transfer, is really that final piece that students do to think about how that the situation they were in and the action they took, what it means for them going forward. So the next model that we can look at is the what, so what, now what model. And this is a relatively simple model and very suitable for novice reflectors and practitioners. Of course, it can be used at different levels. But if you are watching this and looking for a good place to get started, this might be one that you want to investigate a little bit further and talk to your friendly neighborhood educational developer about integrating into your course, because it is a great place for you and for your students to start. It really operates in the need for us to reflect on the real world, identifying and making sense of and responding to real life situations. And it has these three basic questions as starting points: what, where you describe the situation and start to develop self-awareness around the situation; so what, which is analyzing that situation; and now what, which is synthesizing it. And again, like all of these final stages of reflection have in common, looking to the future and to how things might be done differently should the similar situation arise again. Another model we have here, and the second to last one we're going to look at closely today, is the DEAL model. The DEAL model, which stands for describe, examine, and articulate learning, is really helpful for reflections on personal growth, community service learning, and professional development, as well as academic enhancement. So very similar, but with some different guiding questions to the other models, looking objectively at the experience, even to the point of using the 5 W's to very, as objectively as possible, approach the description of that experience, then examining it. And importantly to the DEAL model is the suggestion to examine from one of these 3 categories of learning, so personal growth, civic engagement, or academic enhancement. And finally, articulating that learning by answering questions like, what did I learn? And why does it and what does it matter? Finally, we've included Gibbs' model. And again, you can see that a lot of the sort of categories that or stages the model breaks down into, in this case, this one is a cycle, are similar across. But what Gibbs's model explicitly does is acknowledge that personal feelings influence the situation and how you've begun to reflect on it. So you can see it's positioned right after experience and describing what happened. Feelings come next, and the question, guiding question, is what were you feeling? So again, it recognizes that often it's very difficult to be 100% objective and keep our feelings and emotions out of the situation. In fact, they can become a huge part of why that experience happened and how we might choose to do it differently going forward. So we've looked at 5 models, and there are more, believe it or not, and I'm sure you know this, beyond what we've shared with you here today. And we've really only scratched the surface on any one of these models, just as a way of introducing them to you, letting you know that they're out there and that they're great places to start when you want to start using reflection in your own courses or for yourself. So at this point, if you're feeling like, you know, it's a little bit overwhelming, you need some time to sit with these models and figure out what works best for you, well, that's perfect. That's a great place to be right now. And we'll be sure to share some sources for help and next steps at the end of this presentation. But right now, we can offer up one source of assistance in getting you started, and that is through pebblepad, which is our centrally supported institutional platform that's used for e-portfolios and for tracking learning journeys and a slew of other ways that you can use it. But here at Waterloo, we do have pebblepad, and it has pre-existing templates you can direct your students towards to have them fill out. So if this is the stage you're at, you want to start using it, not ready to make sort of any changes of your own, these are really plug and play, almost worksheets that students can fill in and submit to you. And the ones that pebblepad offers are What, So What, Now What, which we've looked at, a structured reflection, which has a lot of similar stages to the reflections or the templates we've looked at. There's a journal entry one that is very open-ended, and there's the STAR technique, which is portrayed here in the screenshot. So if this is something that's interesting to you, it's an easy way to get started. And again, Catherine or your faculty, or sorry, your faculty liaison here at Waterloo at least is able to help you get started quickly on any of these. And I'm going to toss this back to Catherine now, who is going to talk to you about the teaching and assessment for reflective learning model.
Thanks, Victoria. So as Victoria mentioned, really what we've offered you so far is just a smorgasbord of options. We've looked at various things that we might ask our students to reflect upon. So, you know, it might be content, experiences, the processes to make that learning visible. We've looked at the different perspectives that we could ask our students to examine learning from. And then we've, as Victoria has just done, is offered you a number of frameworks with questions that help students move to those higher levels of reflection. So what I'd like to do now is look at Ryan's teaching and assessing reflective learning model. And this will help give us some guidance on where and when we might integrate these various elements into our program to support reflection. So it looks a little overwhelming, but we're going to dive into it. But at a high level view, along the horizontal axis, the model indicates what that focus of reflection might be and the type of experience you might offer at various points in time throughout the program. So again, it's emphasizing that reflection should be integrated throughout the program in an intentional manner. Along the Y or the vertical axis, the model proposes how you might incorporate a reflective framework throughout a program. In this case, they're using the 4 R's or 5 R's, and they're combining it alongside program outcomes or competencies. So let's take a little deeper look at what that looks like and how it might help you move forward. So if we look at the Y-axis, what they're looking at here is a category-based dimension, which is representing the different levels of reflection. Okay, so if we look at the beige area or the brown area, It has Bain's 4 R's. And they're suggesting that you might want to consider picking a framework and using it throughout the program so that all your instructors and the students become familiar with the language of that particular framework, and that the feedback can be used to improve the quality and the depth of reflection in subsequent courses or different years or different experiences. And in this particular case, as I say, what they've chosen is to use the 4 R's. And as Victoria mentioned, again, you're trying to move the students up into higher levels. So you're starting out here at the reporting and responding, making sure that they do that really well so that they are better prepared for the relating, the reasoning, and the reconstructing. So as students progress throughout the program, again, we're expecting them to start improving their ability to reflect at those higher levels. But again, it's important that they be able to do the lower levels really well so that they can build upon the higher levels. So in their first year, for example, it would be unlikely that your student would be able to easily address, a reasoning level where they're asked to explain an experience in terms of relevant theories or significant factors or existing knowledge, because they just don't have that experience or they don't know the nuances of all the different theories. That's not to say that in the first year, you don't ask them to go through this, but just again, set your expectations to recognizing that they're not going to do it perfectly. They're going to have to practice, and you really want to make sure that they're nailing, these lower levels so that as they begin to excel, they're able to do a much better job at the reasoning and reconstructing. So the other thing that they're doing is the replaceable scales that are adjacent to that reflective scale here. I'll just go back again. What you might want to do is tie that to either learning theories that you're introducing throughout the program. So you might have easier theories introduced in the lower years, or you might start introducing at a very foundational level and then expecting them to go deeper into the theory as they move forward. Or if you've got program outcomes or professional standards, you might want to map that along so that you're introducing certain program outcomes earlier in the program and leaving the more complex ones to later years in the program. When we go along the x-axis, what they're looking at here is representing the various phases of your program. So in year one, you've got your junior students. Some of the things that you might be looking at here would be the foundation, getting into more theory in as they progress through the program, and then as they finally get out into the professional practice or into more of the discipline in a more authentic manner in the more senior years. Early in the program, again, if we look at the focus of reflection, early in the program, students are probably very good at being able to reflect on their own understandings and put it in context to what their lived experience is. Later in the program, though, they can start looking at not only their lived experience, but then start looking at peers or colleagues or clients or just society in general, and seeing how all of these interactions take place in more complex environments, and they can start doing more deeper reflections. So in concert with that, the model also is suggesting, the kinds of experiences that you might offer. So in your first year, it's probably going to be more simulated experiences. You might be doing lectures or discussions or very controlled lab experiences. But then as you move through the program, the kinds of experiences or the kinds of situations that you placed your students in are more authentic or represent things that might happen beyond the classroom. So you might be getting this in co-op or service learning or professional settings. The other piece that I like about the model is that also, if we go back here, these little dots, these are representing what they call teaching episodes that are relevant for students at the particular stage in the program. And so these target a specific level or sometimes a range of reflections. So you'll find that the position of the dots start to move up and become more complex or to the deeper and higher levels of reflection as the students go through your program or your course. So really what this model is doing is giving you a way to intentionally integrate those reflections at appropriate levels throughout your program. So I'm going to pass it back to Victoria, and she'll be looking at some of the approaches that you can take to assessing reflection.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for taking us through the TARL model. It certainly is a little bit to take in at first, but really helpful when broken down and being able to see it from the situation that you have in your own course and program. Here we are. So, what are some approaches you can take to assessing reflection? In other words, where does this leave you today as an instructor? So we've given you a lot, as Catherine said, it's a smorgasbord of options. And what do you do with that now, especially if you're hoping to move forward with something relatively soon, or if you're not part of a program where reflection is ready to be integrated programmatically? So we're going to look at this, and the first question that you want to ask yourself is, what is possible in the time that you have? And the answer to that question really depends on where does reflection fit in. So if reflection isn't integrated programmatically for you, it could be a good idea to assume that your course is the first and only place that students will have an opportunity to practice reflection. So that leads you to this question of what can you do with 4 months, which is the length of a term at Waterloo, at least. So the first thing we recommend is to adjust your expectations. So we're not looking for you to lower them, but adjust them. And by that we mean know that your students can accomplish and you can accomplish a great deal in this time by taking time to set a strong reflection, a strong foundation for reflection for your students. Thinking about it in terms of where they started, which might be with virtually nothing, to leaving your course with this ability to start inquiring about their actions and experiences critically and thinking about them. And this will prepare them better for other reflective activities or other experiences that they have going forward. And that in itself is a huge gain. So one thing you can do to help with this is to clearly have an idea or a sense of what you are assessing and what your students are reflecting on. So this way, students' reflections will be targeted and useful, and your feedback will be useful. And really, it's your feedback and the instances of your feedback that will help them move their ability to reflect forward. And this comes back to the importance of being intentional in what you want your students to learn. Another piece that you can remember or try to build in is 3 scaffolded instances of reflection and feedback. So this is really important again, because after each instance, giving them feedback is what is going to enable them to move forward. And 3 does, or probably sounds like a lot when you're thinking about everything you're already doing in your courses. So just be prepared to think about what things can perhaps be left out while you're still achieving your learning objectives, which can often be done by incorporating reflection and feedback. Plan to return feedback according to your students' needs and your time. So feedback can often be a process that takes a great deal of time, so you have to consider that it gets back to students in a timely way, but that you're also taking care of yourself and your needs. And one thing that can help with this, as we've already looked at, is using reflective frameworks. So here are some approaches to assessment that may help sort of cut back on that time, which is always front and foremost when we're thinking about how we're going to move ourselves and our students through the term. One way to do this is to assess improvement. In other words, considering both the gap and the gain. So wherever students start out with their reflective process, that could be you give them a grade and it's based on where they're starting. But what you're really looking for is how far they come over the term of the course. And then, so maybe by the end, where they started, it doesn't really matter, because it's about how far they've come in that time, and you're going to give them a grade that encompasses everything and overwrites that initial place that kind of just gave you a marker of where they're starting from. Another way is to observe reflection in small or large group discussions. So remembering that reflecting in community is an important criteria of reflection. So you can, circulate through small groups, or attempt this in large groups in your classroom. You can use breakout rooms if you're doing this online, ensuring you're letting your students know you're dropping in, things like that, so that the assessment is kind of happening observationally and in real time. You can provide feedback via rubrics, and we have provided a slide with links for reflective rubrics that will help you get started there. Again, remembering the importance of community, you can incorporate peer evaluation, where students are evaluating each other, and even in the process, learning a little bit more about their own abilities and reflecting on their own writing or their own reflective process by seeing how their peers are doing it. So you're kind of doubling up the reflective activities by having that done. And finally, model how to provide feedback for students or TAs. So whether you are doing peer feedback or you have TAs that can help with feedback, remembering some of the principles of what effective feedback looks like clarifying expectations, motivating learning, opening dialogue, and developing self-assessment skills is really important when it comes to assessing these reflective pieces. So as promised, there is a slide here of resources, and we'll be sure to provide these to anyone who would like for the live links to these rubrics and tip sheets that you can use to get started. And at that, I'm going to pass it back to Catherine to take us home. So Catherine.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Victoria. So here we are. Let's just do a quick recap of where we started and where we are now. So we wanted to know, where does reflection fit into your and your students' plans? Some of the things we want you to remember is that it does take time to do well. And so ideally, it should take place after you've offered some kind of concrete experiences, and it should be offered throughout a program. A really good time to insert a reflective activity is when students are feeling unsettled or confused, or they're perplexed about something. You really want them to provide them with questions that help them unpack how they're feeling and what they've experienced. In terms of what should students reflect on, again, concrete experiences, content, activities. A really important one is to have them not just reflect on their final product, but the process that they went through to create that final product. Have them go back to the learning outcomes in your course and reflect on how far they have come, or how they know that they have achieved these learning outcomes that you've set for them. Give them questions that help them unpack their feelings or reactions. And then help them to identify that the skills that you have helped them develop by completing activities, get them to start thinking about how they can transfer those skills beyond the classroom or beyond their program. How can you get started designing reflective activities for your courses? Again, cultivate that curiosity by asking provocative questions and use the reflective frameworks to get you started. And again, we've got lots of examples of those, but we just scratched the surface too. And what are some of the approaches that you can take to assessing reflection? As Victoria just nicely summed up for us, you don't have to lower your expectations, but adjust your expectations. So try and remember where your students are and where you can realistically take them in the time that you can work with them, and take into account what their previous experience with reflections might be. Focus more on the gain that they're making rather than the gap, because really we can all improve on our reflection, but in the time that you have them, you can really help them move quite far in their reflective their ability to reflect. You can do this by choosing a framework. When you're assessing, we have a number of rubrics, and you can also have them reflect in community. And I hope that finally you'll stay tuned for our upcoming webinars where we take a deeper look at reflections.